Good morning. Welcome to our budget and operating plan overview. And as usual, we'll start with Pledge Allegiance and a moment of silence.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We're ready.
All right, next step in the process. Probably worth noting that for the first time in many years, Deb is sitting back in the audience, but she is here.
She's about as far away as she can get.
Yeah.
She could be in a different room.
This is like church. She's in the back row.
So she can get out of here.
So another step in the process, but I wanted to make sure people understand budget preparations are not done. We have a lot of what bringing to you in place, but work continues on some things. And even in the next couple weeks, we might still have changes that we're making before we come into you. And that will remain true. Even after we bring in the recommended budget to you, there are some things we'll still be working on, and it could be between recommended and proposed. We say, we told you this, but something has changed since then.
So the recommended budget's probably 2 weeks away?
Yes, exactly 2 weeks. Except I think we start at 9, so 2 weeks minus an hour. Few big ideas. After several good years of revenue growth, the revenue for the outlook for us and the state pay for as we move through the years. And there are lots of things for us to be thinking about, but Blueprint is a very dark cloud hanging over our plan. This will come up more as we're talking, and definitely more as we get in deeper into the budget. But there is current legislation that actually doesn't require anything more of us, is requiring much of the school system, but somehow those two things are going to have to come together, and it's hard to imagine that Blueprint is not going to have some impact on our budget at some point, but we have no idea what that's going to be. So the recommended budget will be built on the existing adopted plan and any other board direction we have or will get. And I said things are continuing to develop, and even now, as we're just 2 weeks away from the recommended budget, if other ideas emerge that the board is interested in having something in the budget or not in the budget, we can still take that now, and we will do what we can to make sure that we bring you something that reflects where you want to be and where you want to go. Today, the big point is to set the stage for your budget discussions and decisions to come. We're not going to be looking for any decisions today, but in a similar sort of way, this is a good time to discuss ideas about the process and the budget. I was talking to Commissioner Guerin before, and he was saying I'd probably be talking a lot, which is going to be true. But that doesn't mean that we should not stop if there are things that you want to talk about, so that we understand as best we can how to build things for you or how to be prepared to talk about the things that you're going to want to talk about. Start with the state budget. We start with them because they're making decisions that will potentially, almost certainly, have impact on decisions you have to make, things that we have to do here in Carroll. As always, there is uncertainty. One big thing, the governor's budget is dependent on almost $1 billion of legislative changes. Right now, we don't know what the General Assembly will do with those $1 billion of changes. I would guess that some will make it through and some won't. Which ones do and don't could be very important to us. Their plan is not balanced. In fiscal year 29, as their plans stand, they will be about $3 billion out of balance. Now, of course, just like us, they will have to balance their budget every year. We're not going to wait until fiscal year 29 to see what they're going to do. But the current plan says things don't match up. And we should know more by the proposed sessions, but important decisions could be made by the state after you begin your deliberations. In fact, your first two proposed sessions precede sine die. And we have seen years where they made very relevant decisions at 5 minutes until midnight on the last day of session. So what does the state budget mean here in Carroll County? Take a look at what they call aid to local government. And as always, a reminder that it's not what it sounds like. 85% of this is to schools. It also is funding for health department, community college, library, all organizations that exist in state law and outside of your authority. Less than 10% of what they call aid to local government comes to the commissioners or to the mayors and councils of our towns. But as they lay it out, Carroll County Public Schools get an increase of about $8.5 million, almost 5%. This would seem to be pretty welcome news, but it's not as good as it might seem because most of this is pushed toward Blueprint. So to the extent that they have other concerns or that Blueprint is causing other concerns, this isn't really helping the school system with their budget.
And Ted, you said less than 10% comes to
County and to the towns. Yes. That's why I always object when they call it aid to local government, because the local governments are seeing very little of this. Community college. This is a bad news story. Now, this is the governor's proposal. It will require legislative change, so we don't know this is going to happen. But the governor has proposed changing the funding formula for community colleges. Impact to the college would be a loss of $800,000. This is not a loss of planned funding. This isn't a smaller increase than planned. This is actual less funding than they have in fiscal year 24. And compared to what the existing legislation would give them, they're losing about $1.2 million. Public library, small change, health department, almost 16%. This is an unusually large increase for them. And historically, during bad times with state budgets, counties and towns have been hit the hardest. Health departments have been hit second hardest. Take a look at what's coming to the towns. Highway user revenue. They'll get about $3.5 million. This is across all 8 towns. An increase of about $500,000. Good news, but temporary. This is not the level of funding that we will anticipate in the future. It's what we will be getting in fiscal year 25. Program open space, the towns will lose, or will get about $200,000. That's $400,000 decrease. This is not a policy change. This is a reaction to decreased collections of transfer tax. So the pot is being shared in the same way. It's just a smaller pot.
We discussed at MACO the HUR, getting it from 1 year to continuing as, a moving forward from Now, whether that sticks or not, who knows? But I mean, there's, you kind of have to pick and choose the battles, and, HUR is one of them. When it comes to the BRFA, and we'll see, but you're tracking that, correct?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Okay.
Over the years, I'm not hopeful on highway user revenue. This is kind of ancient history now, but there was a year when the system of sharing these revenues
Right.
had counties getting, I think it was 30% of the pot. Bad state budget year, what went to counties and towns was reduced by 90%. It has been restored some, but nowhere near that, really in a minor way. And it has remained an effort to do something about it. I am definitely not counting on it. The big problem is it's a fairly significant piece of the state budget.
Yeah.
And you're left to say, even if conceptually they wanted to give it back, where's the money going to come from
Right.
to give it to us? And there's no getting around. This is not a big interest item in the General Assembly. Most people don't care about this. You guys, town mayors, but the general public isn't going to Annapolis
Right.
with signs saying increase highway user revenue. Looking at what will come to you. Highway user revenue, similar picture, $3.8 million, a $600,000 increase. Again, this is temporary. In current legislation, we actually will see go up even more in 26 and 27 before dropping again in 28. In the governor's proposal, those increases in 26 and 27 go away. Now, you might notice that the towns get 3.5 and we get 3.8. And if you think about the relative number of miles, you'd say, wait a second, that doesn't seem right. And it's because as some of the highway user revenue has been restored, the state has treated towns better than they have counties. And I don't know the answer. One answer might be that they can do more for towns. They can make a greater impact on towns with less money than they can for the counties. So it might be nothing more than that. Police aid, a minor decrease, and program open space, also a significant decrease for us. We'll get $700,000, $1 million decrease. Our park capital program is largely funded with program open space. We had built a plan based on the amount that was expected. So now efforts are underway to reconsider what that plan is going to look like. Clearly, we can't accomplish what we thought we were going to accomplish. And also worth mentioning here, of that 700,000, 25% of this, and this is true every year, is restricted for land acquisition. So that doesn't even help us with the things that we're mostly interested in. And this will be a point of discussion later in the process, I'm sure, but I've mentioned to you before that even though program open space is available for land acquisition, I think we need to think very, very hard about acquiring new land when we're struggling to develop and maintain the land that we already have.
I've got two quick questions, and one of them may be a little off, but so, did we ever find out, based on the discussions that we previously had, whether or not Bob and Brecken Parks had prioritized or had a priority for the parks that he was interested in pursuing the development thereof?
I think
Deb, I'm sorry.
by default, he has, because as we've been considering this new plan, we are not going to bring in our recommendation the master plans for the new Northwest Park or for the Union Mills Park. I believe Bob is going to come to you and ask to keep the funding for the Union Mills Park, so
Okay.
that becomes his priority, I think.
And thank you very much. And then the other question I have is, so I know we're having discussions or debates down in Annapolis about the extent of solar in counties, right? And so, how do we define a park? For example, could we use Project Open Space money that's assigned to the purchasing of park land to buy parkland to turn it into some kind of solar park? So in other words, we can make up for whatever the state may mandate that we have to do in terms of solar. Instead of having our farmland plowed over, we could purchase parkland and or purchase land for use as like a solar park or something. I mean, is that way off the?
There's legislation out there to use park property for solar.
Okay.
Both blacktop and unusable park property for solar projects. I don't know, I think we were okay with it. Honestly, I can't remember, and I don't know where it is in the bill process, but yeah, your thoughts about using parks, I mean, you don't want to take away the playgrounds or
Right.
the usable areas, but
Right.
there's park property that is not, good for other things, and
Steep slopes and things
yeah.
like that.
so that I know is being looked at across the state, and therefore there could be that potential here in the county. But again, I don't know where that bill is in place right now.
I'll send Mike Fowler an email. Thank you, Ed.
Now, even if that happens, I would caution jumping ahead to thinking down the road that you were going. I think my expectation would be the state would still want program open space to create parks. If that happens to create the opportunity for solar in certain parts, that's one thing, but an idea that we could buy land just for solar with program open space seems unlikely to me. But
I appreciate the
Happen.
perspective, but yeah, who knows? I mean, we have to be something. We have to be nothing if not creative in this budget cycle. So,
And just so
Park
I'm,
properties are not ours. I mean, they're private property.
well, I apologize. I mean, if the state says you have to have so many acres or so many kilowatt hours being generated of solar, and if we say, well, we can find an alternative way to meet those requirements rather than farmland, I guess
Yeah,
that's-
but I mean, to me, it's the property owners, again, rights on how they want to use their properties, and that's why they're going to the state and the PSC's engagement, on whether they can do that here in the county or not. But I know what you're saying, but I just don't know of properties that are in the county that are county properties, long-term, that could be converted into solar. And I don't know if there's any initiatives to do that or not, so, but, anyway.
And
Just-
back, oh, I'm sorry.
go ahead.
Well, back to the first question. Rec and Parks Advisory Board has like a 5-year plan for capital projects. Is that on the website? Is that, or, so that would tell you their priorities. Now, they can change, just like our budget, you can jump things ahead or behind 2 years, and every time you evaluate it, if it's not this year, it's not, it can be changed, but that would give you a good indication.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was kind of getting at the most recent discussions we'd had over the last couple of months. I don't know when that plan was updated, so that's why I was asking, yeah.
They do it at least once a year, but
Okay.
they probably discuss it more often.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, just so I'm straight, because I'm trying to identify, flexibilities. So the amount we get from Project Open Space, that is a cumulative amount, so we can bank that, and when we get the amount we think we need, we can use it. But is there a timeline on that? I thought it was 5 years.
There's a couple considerations, and I'm not sure if it's 5, it might be, which is an expectation of you doing something with the money. The other thing that comes into play sometimes, this is again about bad state budget times, though sometimes we'll look around and say what money hasn't been spent, and say, you haven't spent it, give it back. And this has happened to us before. And it's not always about, do you have a plan? It's just you haven't spent the money. So that's, there's a lot to be said for trying to spend it as you're getting it, but there are times when yes, we have a project that might require more than we could do at one time. But sometimes that's dealt with by doing projects in phases, like Trimgold, for example, was not all budgeted or done at one time. There were maybe three pieces.
And it is a correct statement that that money can only be used to purchase land. Again, I'm trying to figure out if we have flexibility here. It has to be used to purchase real estate.
Well, no, there's two pieces. 25% of it is restricted to buying land.
Yeah.
The other 75 is what we use for developing.
Don't we share some of it with the towns?
Yes.
And we share some of it with the towns.
Development to include improvements, like lighting and things like that.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay,
Ball fields, lighting.
Yeah, and there's
okay.
a lot of things we can do. It's not totally open to us. There are places we can't go with program open space. But most of what we accomplish in our park capital project is getting done with program open space.
Now, you mentioned this is potential dollars that could be taken back from the state if not used appropriately or if we bank it too long. What other dollars does the state provide that they are looking at us to either use in a specific time frame or not use at all that they would be taken back?
First, I want to make sure I'm careful. I'm not suggesting that the state is looking at the money now, just saying.
I understand, but,
it has happened in
okay,
the past.
so they have the capability or potential, or not even potential, but they have a tool in place to take money back if not used in a timely manner, like Commissioner Garin was alluding to.
Nothing else comes to mind.
Okay,
We get funding for schools, school capital projects, college capital projects, sometimes library capital projects. I can't recall
okay.
a similar thing ever happening with any of those. I don't know, anything.
And
One that's coming to my mind would be highway user revenue. Not that the state has ever said that they would take it back, and not that there's necessarily a timeline, but there
Right.
are reports that we have to provide every year on how we're using it and how much we're using. So if we started to accumulate a large balance of highway user revenue, I wouldn't be surprised.
Highway user revenue, however, is not as restrictive as Project Open Space, correct?
It does have restrictions on how you can use it and for what purposes.
Right.
But typically, again, the construction and maintenance of
Right.
roads, among other things.
Yeah,
Yeah, the details differ, but I would look at it as similarly restrictive.
okay,
You can't just choose what you want to do with it.
right.
is there still a threat that if Blueprint's not properly funded, they could take some income tax money from us and give it to the schools directly? Is that still a threat?
Yeah, I'm not aware, I don't remember hearing any state official make the threat, but we know it's there. This has come up in other contexts that, the state has said, if you don't meet your obligations, we will keep your income tax so that you do meet the income.
I've heard Rachel Heiss say it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, at the
Yeah,
Macon
same.
County Ministers Conference, she very definitely said it.
And, although Dr. Kerwin is not a state official, he definitely shares that sentiment. And, I think it's that I won't say threat is out there, but, they try to hold it over us. And everybody says, well, that doesn't make common sense, so therefore it's not going to happen. But we still have to
I
be-
absolutely believe it could happen.
Right.
Now, again, our current situation, though, it's not a direct threat to Carroll County because we have no legislated obligation to do anything. So there's not anything that we're not doing.
Right.
So there's nothing to say, you haven't done it, so we're going to keep your money. But it seems reasonably likely at some point the state is going to make a change that is going to change our obligation, and then we will be up against that.
Yep.
Okay, so where are we? Projected end for fiscal year '24, our current budget. Looking at the revenue side, We budgeted $542.8 million. Our current projection right now is 527.9, or almost $15 million less than budget. This is a very different story than what you heard last year or Commissioner Rothstein in the last board heard for a couple years.
Yep.
We have been coming in saying we're expecting revenue in excess of what we budgeted. Now, we're going to talk more about revenues as we get a little deeper into this presentation. But the big question mark here is income tax. I'm not saying that we know these numbers. This is what we believe we can come to you with what we know today. And again, we're going to talk about the individual revenues, but big drivers here are income tax is pushing us down, recordation is pushing us down, property tax and investment income are helping to push back the other way. So it could have been worse. Now, thinking through what we expect at the end of the year, this 14.9, that's the same number I just told you. What we expect revenues to come in under budget. 5.2 is the reserve for contingency, what's still unspent, and we expect to remain unspent. Other budgets that haven't been spent, we have about $9 million estimate right now. Now, every day that goes by, we get closer and closer to a degree of comfort saying what's not going to get spent. I expect that number will grow before we get to the end of this. And one big thing that could change this, we still have $1.2 million unspent in snow and storm emergencies. We can be reasonably optimistic that that's going to be unspent or largely unspent. But we can't ignore that we have had snow in March, we have had snow in April. And wind events are not restricted to any time of the year. But likely the unexpended will improve. But as things stand, between revenues coming in under budget and us not spending what we have budgeted, we have $800,000 in the hole. We are currently sitting on an unassigned fund balance. This would be what was true as of the end of the fiscal year 23 budget of $44.3 million. Now, 4.9 of that is planned for 26. This is the 1% that we carry into the future. And not a new idea, but I would love to see that go away someday. But given everything else we're doing, it's hard for me to come to you now and say, let's give up $4.9 million of revenue. So if we look at what we expect to have happen at the end of 24, what we have from 23, what we're planning to take to 26, that indicates a projected 24 unassigned fund balance of minus $5.7 million. Now, this is the place where when we think back to recent years, and I keep telling people, don't get used to this. This is not the norm. This is why I've been saying it. Not that I predicted this number, but I knew that at some point, things weren't going to continue to look the same. Now, we are also, in our recommended budget to you, suggesting some use of unassigned fund balance, and this will get talked about in greater detail. But this will be going, there are 3 capital projects that at the end of fiscal year 24, you all pulled money off of. In our recommendation, we've put money back onto those things again, in all cases because we believe it's where we need to be. Now, of course, as we get into this, you can say, look, we told you once, take it off. We're telling you again, take it off. And if that's where we end up, then we'll do it. But when we get to those things, we'll talk more about what our thinking is. The end result of all that would be to reduce our current unassigned fund balance of $44 million to $24 million. Still not a bad place to be, but not the same kind of picture we've had for the last several years. All right, let's start looking ahead now. Revenue projections. These are our biggest revenues. This is almost the whole story here. We have more than 100 revenues, but this is the money. The blue is there for a reason. I want to draw your attention to income tax, and we'll be talking more about this. But on this slide, just a quick look at what's happening. Property tax, 24. We budgeted 233. We think we're going to get 233. We rarely get surprises in property tax. The only two things that can really happen to us, well, three things. The state made a mistake in the numbers they gave us. There is some big appeal that happens after we get the numbers, or there's some significant new construction that gets picked up early enough to hit these numbers. As we look ahead to 25, we're suggesting $246 million. We'll talk more in a second, but this is a good news story because the last reassessment was higher than we had planned for. Income tax, very, very different story. We budgeted 24 at $207 million. We're suggesting now 191.5. Now, for 25, we are still expecting growth, but it's going to be growth off of a lower base. And, on this idea of growth, across the state, this is an idea that's getting a lot of debate, what to do about 25. Everybody is sharing similar concerns about 24, but what do we do about 25? And there are counties who are building in a decrease for 25. There are counties that are more or less flat for 25, and there are counties like us who are still saying, let's expect growth. Now, I'm not saying this with total confidence that we should expect growth. But right now, it seems to me what we're seeing is more about an adjustment than it is a change in kind of the fundamental growth.
Shouldn't we see, in addition to this, the picture of the unexpected growth and how that would play out? I mean, you're giving your best insight in providing this type of growth in income tax, but like you shared, it could go the other way, and it could be flat or less.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
And, I just, this is one of those times you're actually sharing the cup more than half full by doing this, and I'm not used to seeing that. So, not to be overly guarded, but how would this look if the cup wasn't half full and it went on the same glide path that, we've with FY24? Does that make sense or no?
Yes, and something we've spent a lot of time
Yeah.
talking about. So if there's no growth, then 25 would be 191.5, just
Right.
like 24. And everything you're going to see in the up plan would be worse by $8 million
Right.
and growing. Now, I don't think you should look at this as unexpected growth, though. What we're doing here is we had plans for growth. We're keeping those plans for growth. We're just applying it to a lower starting number. But there's absolutely room for concern. Will we actually, get that growth? And unfortunately, we won't know in time. We get another 50% of our income tax between now and the end of the year, but you will have
Right.
adopted your budget before we have that. So when we see that, we might have a better idea. And it's probably a good point. Now, if we get a stronger sense that we shouldn't expect that growth for 25, I think that would lead us to discussions very early in 25 to reconsider some of what we've budgeted and say, this no longer seems realistic. Not an ideal way to go about things, but that might be the choice we
Well,
get.
I mean, this attitude, and that's not a bad word, that's out there that we are growing, in this county. And there's more houses for sale and more this and more that and all of this outrageous development, the reality is it's not.
Yeah, there's actually a
Overall, in the
slide.
entire county, I apologize. And I just, you know, we need to be grounded in the sense that, well, what used to have 1,000 home sales, now it's 135, that impact is X. And, you know, with, again, the concerns with overgrowing an area, looking at the entire county, we are not growing. And we only have limited real space to grow.
Yep.
So,
And there actually is a slide coming up that
okay,
visually makes it pretty easy to see that
Okay.
we are not growing rapidly.
yeah, okay, I apologize.
Nope. Recordation, we budgeted 15 and a half. We're now only expecting 12.7. And recordation is one where we have pretty good data. Every month, we get what actually happened. So that doesn't tell us with certainty what the future is, but we know where we are now, and we're not going to get to 15.5. The kind of growth and activity we'd have to have is just not reasonable to assume. But this is another one where we don't think this is the end of growth. We are still building in growth, but again, it will be on a lower base. Railroad and public utilities and business property, these are other pieces of property tax. Nothing very interesting happening there. Investment income, we budgeted 3.8 for '24, and we're now figuring 7.4. So this, in the short term, is a good news story. Although you need to keep in mind with investment income, the flip side of this is when we borrow money, we have to pay more to borrow money too. So you have things pulling us in different directions. We are not expecting this to stay at that level. 25, we're suggesting $6.5 million. And you remember, there's two pieces to how much we have here. One is how much are you earning on your investments? The other is how much money do you have to invest? And we have some big capital projects that have cash on them that are right now sitting there earning money, but we will be starting to spend that money, so it's no longer going to be available for investing. So if you look down to the bottom line, and again, remember, this is not the whole budget, but this is the biggest part of your revenue. 481 in '24, dropping to 466 in as we expect for '24, and then growing to about 488. So from '24 to '25, there's growth, but this is not spectacular growth by any means.
Yeah, before we leave this slide, I mean, I want to point out that there has been growth in the county budget, and there has been growth in revenue for the past 4 or 5 years, so I think that's worth noting. The issue about income tax and how the projection is lower, I haven't had anybody explain to me why yet, and if this is happening around the state. I mean, wages are up, spending's up, so why are we seeing income tax revenues going down in Maryland?
A question we have as well. And yes, this is not about Carroll, this is about the entire state. And people like me across the state and the comptroller's office meet regularly to talk about this. And the state has a lot more data, but they don't really have answers either. Now we have, this is kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but one really surprising thing in this last distribution, withholdings was down. Not a lot, but it was down, which was surprising to everybody. Kind of the same thing you're saying.
Yeah, that is correct.
Why is that? And we don't have an answer. The bigger swings in income tax tend to be about estimated payments and unearned income, which often run together. You look to the withholdings to be the more stable part of what's going on. So this is worrisome, but we don't have answers. This would be a lot easier to talk about, if we thought we knew that we could explain, what's going on. But this is what we face with income tax all the time. It's not until years after that you can look back and say, okay, we see now what happened. And an explanation you and others have heard before, but just to make sure that nobody's beating up on the state. Remember, it's a very awkward arrangement. The state collects our income tax for us. During the year, they send us money based on an assumption of what part of the pot that we're supposed to get. everybody knows that that number is going to be wrong, but nobody knows, is it going to be too little or too much? So then there's a series of reconciling distributions to, as money coming in is attached to Carroll County income tax returns, and there's more certainty, those reconciling distributions move us to where we want to go. But it takes 3 fiscal years to totally reconcile one tax year. So there's a lot we don't know. And this isn't the whole thing, but another thing that muddies it for us is people who are making estimated payments are not always paying what they're eventually going to pay. Depending on the situation, under tax law, there's a minimum you have to pay. But you might know, I'm eventually going to pay more than that, but that's not showing up until much later. And when people making tax decisions, and we went through this, not this last presidential election, but the one before that, there was a lot of thinking that people in anticipation of the election were making tax decisions. They were changing their behavior. And then when that actually led to changes in tax law, we saw another series of tax behavior. So it became even harder than ever to understand what's really happening here, what's moving around pieces, and what's changing your fundamental revenue. So that's a long way of saying I don't know the answer to your question.
Has it been shared or thought of that 1 to 2% or whatever percent of those making the largest amount of income in the state are leaving the state? I mean, you have a larger retirement with large income because they don't want their money taxed, leaving states that are more tax friendly. I mean, I have my income from retirement and disabilities that's taxed in Maryland. I go somewhere else, it's no longer taxed. Now, that's a fraction of what some of these folks with 6, 7, 8 figure type of retirements and salaries. I mean, that can move the needle, can it?
I've seen analysis that suggests that's happening. I've seen analysis that
Okay.
says it's not
Okay.
happening. But for me, totally out of my control, totally out of my
Well,
understanding.
just I understand the control, but I mean, just to give us a, hey, this is being thought of, and these are things we should
Yeah.
just be aware of. I don't know.
That's
I'm
something
just-
that would happen in Annapolis.
That might be one of the best explanations yet for what's happening, but if that is happening, you probably are not going to hear about it from the state, because it's not something they would want to talk about. I
No,
would
you're right,
imagine.
because they want to continue to publicize the fact that Maryland is the best place to live for everyone. But the reality is, there are states that are tax-free for very large income families. I mean, like, very, very, very large income families. So, okay. Thanks.
That's a good point.
Look at the changes from the plan that exists today to the plan that we are looking ahead to. Oh, wait a second. Oh, I jumped ahead. Okay, so
This is the next.
I think you're on the right page, Ted.
Yeah, so if we're thinking about how this changed, first row there is real property tax. That's the impact of the changes that I was telling you about, and we're still going to get deeper into this in a second. Then real property and business, which aren't really having much impact. But you can see here what property tax added to your bottom line. This made everything better. Didn't make everything better. It made the bottom line better than it was. Then property tax, this line is the same, the bottom line of the last slide I showed you. Then you have income tax. This is the negative impact that we're looking at from income tax, which you see is larger than the positive impact from property. Investment income, Gives us a little boost in '25, less in the other years. And that's because we are not expecting to keep generating the same level of revenue, both because there's a reasonable chance that interest rates will back off some, but almost certainly our portfolio size is going to get smaller. Recordation, making us worse off. Again, as you go further out in the years, it's not much because in the short term, this is a bigger change than we planned, but in the longer term, it's kind of what we were expecting. And then all of our other revenues, a relatively small change. So all the revenues in total, you see, have made the bottom line worse off between 10.8 million in '25 and 4.8 million in, or well, 2.8 in '28, but then a little bit higher in '29 again. All right, now let's dig in a little bit deeper to each of these. And our conversations have taken us some places where I might have gone when I get here, so I'll be just filling in some holes in some cases. This is a history of reassessments. Each bar is the assessment of one of our three groups in the year that it was reassessed. And you see back to the left, this is the big building boom back in '6 and '7 and '8. Still astounding to think about, 40, 50% reassessment numbers. But remember, back then and now, those assessments don't directly translate into revenue. The blue line you see further down is the revenue change. And for those listening who, aren't up on this, the reason it doesn't lead to as much revenue as you might think is in Maryland, we phase in assessment increases over 3 years. And in Carroll County, we have a 5% homestead tax credit. So it doesn't matter how much your assessment goes up, your tax bill and our revenue can't go up more than 5% a year. Then you see the bars dip below the line. Before that time, I would have told you property tax always goes up. Might go up less, might go up more, but it always goes up. Until then, now I can't say that anymore. And if you look at that blue line, you see it actually dips below zero. We were actually collecting less money than we were in an earlier year. Then we recover and you see years of 6, 7, 8% growth. I'm going to call for just easy purposes, more normal sort of growth. And then you see our more recent boom in prices. And remember, this was pretty unexpected for us. When we hit the COVID shutdowns, our fear was that nobody's going to be buying a house. And what actually happened was people were buying houses like crazy and prices were being driven up. And we saw the last three reassessments, 12, 24, and 24. So let's look at these reassessments now in a little bit different way. And every time we get to this, I have to reorient myself, so I will reorient you too. The group that was just reassessed, the one we got around January 1st, was Group 3, Westminster and the Northwest. That was the 24% increase. You see 5% here, and actually 555 across 3 years. That's because of our homestead tax credit. That's what we can build in. Next year, Group 1, South Carroll, will be reassessed. South Carroll runs east to west all the way across the county and is our biggest assessment group. Years ago, I think they probably were set up to be roughly equal. But the last time I saw this number, South Carroll was 42% of our assessment. So it has a larger impact, good or bad, when something happens down there. Now, we actually had built in assessment growth of 12%. Well, no, in the plan, yes, 12%. I think it was 12. But in reaction to this last reassessment, we increased this to 15%. Now, our thinking is when you look back at Group 3 and Group 2 and those two 24%, that wasn't so much about what was happening in those years as it was catching up on what had happened over a 3-year period. In Group 1, their last assessment was 12. We think it's likely that they have not caught up on what's happened over these last 3 years, and that we're going to still see noticeable growth. I don't think we're going to see 24s, but we're thinking that, something like 15 might be a reasonable place to be. Now, whether it's 24 or 15, that still leads to 5% a year, for us. But then after Group 2, after Group 1, our thinking is that we're likely to have caught up to what had happened in this big boom in housing prices. And that's where you see Group 2, North Carroll, we're building in a 5% assumed assessment, and that's true for the remainder of the plan. Pardon me?
You just circled 1.6.
1.6.
That's because it's 1/3 of 5.
Okay.
So 5% assessment phased in over 3 years. And that's true for each of the next 3 assessments after that. Now, I'm not sitting here telling you that we're predicting a 5% reassessment in fiscal year 30. This just seems to be a prudent level of expectation with what we know today. And remember, this does not sit for 6 years. Every year, we will evaluate the information we have and revisit this. So if South Carroll comes in at 24%, we'll have to think about what that means. Or if it comes in at 9%, we'll have to think about what that means. So then you go down to the bottom, and remember, because of this 3-year assessment, the actual impact to our growth is a blending of what has happened in the last 3 assessments. So everything you see for 25 is the 4.3, the 5, and the 5, giving us 4.35% growth. These 2 years of 4.5% growth, that's unusual for us. We don't often see that level of growth. And you can see that as you go forward, we don't expect that to continue. As we phase in lower assessments, the 24s will eventually fade out and be replaced by, the 15 and the 5 and the 5.
Can you define growth?
More dollars received than previously. So, this is growth in the assessable base leading to growth in property tax revenue.
So therefore, residential, commercial, industrial, wherever we are bringing in more dollars.
Yes. Yes, this is our entire assessable base.
Okay.
And just for context, the residential portion of our assessable base is probably 82% or something like that. Commercial, industrial, maybe 12, ag 6. And I might not have those numbers exactly right, but the proportions are roughly right. And that coming up is a good place to say, sometimes people look at our commercial industrial base, the percent, and want to draw some conclusions. And there are some conclusions you can draw when you compare our commercial industrial assessable to Howard or to Frederick. We are much lower. But smaller changes are often much more about what's happening in the residential section than it is about what's happening in the commercial industrial. Like just recently with these big house price increases, that would tend to depress our commercial industrial, not because we're not adding dollars, but because we've added more dollars on the residential side. Now, reassessment is not the whole story with property tax, though. This line here is what's left from the last slide we looked at. What do we expect to change from reassessments? We also have new growth, new construction, and we need to add that into the mix. We have been assuming for a number of years, and it continues to be our assumption in this plan, $125 million of new construction a year. That translates into about $1.25 million of revenue. We have actually exceeded $125 million every year for the last handful of years. but I'm reluctant to suggest that we up our expectations here. A number of reasons, but one, and we'll be looking at home building permits again, is how much growth can we actually expect? And on the commercial industrial side, something that came up a little bit earlier, a concern I have, and this is not about me trying to play planner, it's just me saying, how do things translate or not into revenue? And, we mentioned industrially zoned land earlier. We're running out of it. And we don't have as much as it might appear because some of the parcels we have are not really desirable parcels for somebody who's looking to develop here. We've had pretty good success with industrial development in recent years. But if there's not land for people to build on, then that success can't continue.
I think Jack just smiled down on you.
Yes, my goal in life.
Ted, you said $125 million in new construction a year, and what was the amount generated from that, or the rough?
About $1.25 million. So at some point, if the amount of land we have doesn't support the level of activity we've had, then that new construction is going to start to drop off. Now, alternatively, if we do zone more land industrial and continue to have success, that might be the time to rethink, could we actually expect more? This is the same history we showed you, but now we've added the projections for the future. Those are the orange bars. And you can see the 15% that I talked about for South Carroll next year, followed by a series of 5% reassessments. Now, this seems like a big drop from where we've been recently, but it's much more in line with what I would say, can generally expect when we're not having unusual things in the housing market. So total real property tax, we budgeted about we had an actual in '23 of about $218 million. We're now expecting about $229 million in '24, and we're looking ahead to $240 million in '25. Now, if we look at property tax from the existing plan to a future plan, here's the plan we have today. Here's what we're bringing to you. And you can see that in every year, that actually adds to your bottom line, puts us in a better position. We don't have to spend a lot of time here, but just want you to be aware that there are other pieces to this. We talked about new construction, we talked about reassessments. I mentioned the homestead tax credit, but I didn't quantify it. Right now, we have about $5 million of, in theory, property tax revenue that's sitting on the sideline. We're not receiving it because people's bills are not going up enough to give it to us. Now, in theory, as assessments fall below the homestead tax credit, we'll start to receive that. Now, depending on what happens, you could get it in 2 years or you get it in 20 years, or not at all. When we went through that last big boom and then the bust, we had $24 million sitting on the sidelines. And when we got into a series of negative reassessments, that $24 million went away forever. So the assessments that seemed so big, in the end, in a practical way, didn't turn out to be that big. People never paid on assessments that reached what they appeared to be. And a good point to remind people, I usually say this at some point, we talk about good news, bad news on property tax revenue. When I talk about good news, I'm talking about from a county revenue point of view, this is good news. I understand for any one property owner, it's not good news at all. Income tax, our second largest revenue. And as we've talked about a little bit, unlike property tax, this is not a good news story at all, but a bad news story. These are our quarterly distributions. Each dot is that distribution, percent change against the same distribution in the previous year. About 90% of your income tax revenue comes in these distributions. I always talk about income tax as notoriously volatile. You can look at this. You don't have to be a data analyst to see, wow, that jumps around a lot. And I always say, don't ever try and draw a line through part of this graph and predict the future. You know, you could draw a line there, and then you have this. You could draw a line here, and then you have this. And it happens over and over again. And going back to Commissioner Guerin's question earlier, when these things happen, we almost never have a ready explanation for what's going on at that moment. But we know this is what we deal with. And it's why this is what drives us to be so careful about not falling in love with what appear to be trends and not ever forgetting how quickly things can change. So then recently, we had a 10% increase there, followed by 6% and 3% decreases. For these two distributions here, these are both actually smaller than the same distribution last year. Now, I mentioned this is about 90% of the revenue. There are a few other little pieces, like people who file late might have to pay penalty and interest. We get some money in connection with that. Then there's also those reconciling distributions. How do we bring what we got from an assumed percentage in line with what we eventually learn from income tax data? I didn't really say this earlier, but it might not be obvious to everybody. But when money is withheld from my paycheck, it gets sent to the state. They know they received the dollars, but they don't know it belongs to me. They don't know it belongs to Carroll County. It's not until I send a tax return that they can actually make that connection. So that's why when I say bring together the assumed distribution with the actual tax returns, that's what I'm talking about. So in '23, we budgeted $183 million and got $206 million. And this is the point where people were often looking at me and say, Ted, why are you being so careful? Look how much this is growing. And it wasn't the only year. We had 3 years of growth that was what I would call out of the norm. But this is the place where I'm saying this isn't going to continue. Let's be careful on committing this money to ongoing costs. And one of the things that's really important, and when we looked at 23, is this right here. Remember, I'm talking about those reconciling distributions. We went up almost $23 million against budget. $23 million of increase was in those reconciling distributions. Now, I'm not saying to put those things directly together, but I am saying a whole lot of that increase was because of things that happened in other tax years, not what was happening in fiscal year '23. And in fact, this year, we had a reconciling distribution that was down $10 million against the same distribution last year. And that's further complicated by, the 23 reconciling was up against the 22 reconciling. And you can see how difficult it gets for this to understand what's happening. So we had an actual of $206 million for '23, and we budgeted $207 million. That's me arguing this isn't all real. I mean, it's real money, but it isn't real growth. It isn't something you can count on into the future. And at the time, it was pretty hard to argue for $207 million. Now, I wish we had budgeted something less than 207. Now, I have no regrets about what we did based on what we knew at the time we did it. But knowing now, I'd say, boy, it would sure have been good if we had done 200 or 195. But, we didn't, so here's where we are now.
does it stand to reason then that we should be a little more cautious than what we already are in the coming years in projecting?
Well, I think, we're going to be reducing the base, so we're going to be cautious in that sense. The other piece is where Commissioner Rothstein went earlier. How do we think about not the base, but what growth is going to be in the future? And we'll be getting to this in just a second,
Okay.
but what we have done is apply the same assumed growth to a lower base. But clearly it's open to be argued, should we expect that same level of growth? And a big part of my thinking, though, is where Commissioner Guerin was going. What do we see happening that makes us think that we're not going to be growing? Our unemployment is very low. Wage growth has slowed some, but wage growth has been pretty strong. We're seeing jobs added. There's nothing in that screams out growth is coming to a halt. But again, it's one of those things where it's never enough for me to confidently sit here and say, I know what to tell you, what I think is the right thing to do. So what we're always doing with every revenue, this is just the hardest one. What we're always doing is saying, with the information we know, with the assumptions we think we can reasonably make, this is a number we think we can bring to you and say, you can plan with some confidence that this is going to happen this way. Not absolute confidence, but some level of confidence. And as I've said before, my goal is always to bring you revenue numbers that get close to what's really going to happen without going over what's really going to happen. The worst thing I can do to you is give you revenue numbers that are bigger than what actually show up. So for 24, we're suggesting we're going to get 191.5. We're talking about $14 million below what we budgeted, which is why I say now, I wish we had budgeted something less. And then for 25, we're projecting 199.5. So that's still growth from here to here, but it's less than we actually got in fiscal year 23.
But do you think it's reasonable that we would generate an additional $8 million of revenue?
Yes, that is what I'm saying now.
Okay.
And that's roughly 4% growth. So, $8 million is a lot of money. It's not a huge amount of growth. But again, I mentioned a little bit earlier, across the state, different jurisdictions are thinking differently about what to do here. And the details can be different. There are jurisdictions like Montgomery and Howard that are much more subject to swings because of unearned income than Carroll County is. They might have reasons to approach it differently than we do. There are some jurisdictions who might not be seeing job growth, might not be seeing the same levels of wage growth. Now, if the board's feeling was 4% growth is overly aggressive, we can back away from that. Backing away, though, means the bottom line gets worse. It's already a negative. There are going to be things that you want to do that right now I can't say where the money would come from. We would just make the problem that much more difficult. And there's always tension between these two ideas. What do you expect from your revenue? And when you restrict the revenue, what does that do to choices you can make on the expenditure side, the service providing side? Now, I would never make an argument to you, let's up this revenue because it's going to make it easier for you to provide services, which brings me back to it's always a balancing act between how do I give you the room that I think is appropriate and not restrict you in a way that isn't necessary.
And that goes back to the question an hour ago about should we be looking at 199.5 or 191.5?
Yes.
And, I mean, there's definite benefits I can see for both, but I mean, unfortunately, it's a crapshoot in knowing, and you know, like you said, people look at it a different way. I think we should have the option to look at it in both ways, knowing that that's a level of uncertainty, you know, so,
And we can have those discussions.
yeah.
The thing you should be comfortable with is believing that I have never brought to the board a number that I didn't believe. You know, I have uncertainty, I have doubt, but I've never brought a number that I said, that's not going to happen.
Right.
So when we look existing plan to new plan, here's what's in your current 24 to 29 plan. Here's what we're suggesting. The result of that is to make every year worse off, significantly worse off. Recordation is our third biggest revenue, but it's in a whole different league. You know, property tax is heading for 250 million, income tax is around 200 million. Here, we're talking 15 million. Here's history. These are actual recordation collections, year by year. If you go back a little bit further, we actually had almost $24 million in 1 year before we hit a decline. And back here, I can remember discussions, well, how far do we think, this is falling. We believe it's going to fall. How far could it fall? And we settled in on something like $13 or $14 million. And in fact, it went to $8 million. And you know, just want to say, I can't know what I don't know. I would have never believed we would fall to $8 million. But what happened is the housing market slowed down so much that we collected a third of what we were collecting a handful of years earlier. I never believed 24 was sustainable, but I don't think I would have seen that kind of drop come into place. But remember, you know, that was a period where, you know, we got into problems with foreclosures. Carroll County was not hit as bad as many other places, but you didn't have to drive around too much to find foreclosure signs or to see signs that, well, that house looks like it's in foreclosure. Then we got to, you know, what I, again, would say is kind of more normal growth, or not growth, but collections, $14 million a year. And then you see the recent boom. Housing boom was the same thing. You know, people were buying houses. Every time a house is sold, somebody is paying 1% on it, and that's what's showing up here. That 21 million, that's the second highest year we've ever had. So similarly, we got there, no thinking on our part that we're going to continue at that level. This is a place where I'd say I have certainty. It's not going to continue at that level. It's going to drop off. The question is always, to what?
Right.
And you see between 22 and 23, we dropped from 21 to $16 million. And then we expected something like this, but now we're looking at maybe $13 million in fiscal year 24. So our actual 23 was about 16 million. We budgeted 15 and a half. We think we're going to get 13. And for 25, we're budgeting 14. So much like income tax, we don't think this means the end of growth. And recordation is driven by two things. How many transactions do you have, and what's the average value of the transaction? I don't think there's any reason to expect right now that homes won't continue to appreciate in Carroll County. They're just not going to continue to appreciate the way they did in the last few years. And year to year, see, this really doesn't change things very much because our expectations were that we were going to drop off to $14 or $15 million. It does make a difference this year just because the drop was more sudden than we counted on.
Ted, real quick, if I could, I meant to ask you this question a few minutes ago. So we had the issue with 107,000 property owners in Maryland not receiving their property tax bills on time. Where does that put us budget-wise? I was just curious what the implications and issues would be.
If nothing is done, we would lose money for 3 years. It would get bigger each year, getting to about $1 million in the third year. So certainly would not be happy about it, but it's not a staggering impact. I fully expect that the General Assembly is going to do something about it. And they have two obvious paths. One would be for the state to appropriate money that they would give to the counties to offset that change. The other would be to change the law. And the problem right now is if you don't receive your assessment by a certain date, it's as if it never happened. They could change that date to say it still applies, and what would go along with that is also extends the date that you'd be able to appeal your assessment. That seems like the more likely path to me, but I don't know. But it sounds like all the talk in Annapolis seems to be recognition that this is a mistake the state made, wasn't the county's fault, the county shouldn't be responsible for it.
Thanks.
Investment income, another good news story. And again, good news strictly on a county revenue point of view. It's bad news for us and what we have to pay for debt, and it's bad news for many consumers who are finding that mortgages aren't as cheap as they've been for the last decade. The pink line is the dollars coming in. And you can see how that dropped after the Great Recession. We got into territory that we have never experienced before. Even as long as this lasted, we had never been there, or at least not in any history I have. The blue line is the average rate we're receiving on our investments, and you can see how low that got. Now things are changing. Interest rates have gone up. The amount of dollars we're earning has gone up. This is a place, though, where I'd say we don't want to draw a line into the future, or even a more modest one and assume rates are keep going up. I don't think we have any reason to believe that. And if anything, I think what's more likely is we'll see some decline in rates, not back to where we've been, but a leveling off. So actual 23 was $5.3 million. Again, just for some context, where those lines were down around the bottom, I think we were down around $200,000 a year or something like that. We were earning literally almost nothing on our investments. And that, $200,000 is on a portfolio that was probably $200 million. We're forecasting 7.5 for 24 and budgeting 6.5 for 25. Again, I mentioned this earlier, expect some leveling off of interest rates, but more specifically, we know we have cash on capital projects that's going to start getting spent. We won't be investing that money anymore. So even if rates stayed the same, we wouldn't keep the same level of earnings. Plan to plan, you'll see a gain here, even as I'm saying, we're going to back off of expectations. It's still larger than what we had built into the plan. Building permits is not a big revenue. I include it here, though, because it has ties to things that are big revenues, and it's, I think, an important way for us to look at things. And going back to something Commissioner Rothstein said earlier, if you go back earlier in history, residential permits, 1,200, 1,400, 1,500 units a year. That's not where we are anymore. 300 is kind of where we are. And we could see variations from year to year, but I don't believe, without some fundamental change in Carroll County, that we will ever return to 1,000+ permits a year. And you had a presentation recently on concurrency management. Concurrency management came out of those years. The concern was, how do we keep our infrastructure, relevant for the number of houses that we're building. I'm still worried about infrastructure, but we're not in the same kind of position we were back then. And the reason I say I don't think we're ever going to go back to 1,000 units a year. We've built a lot of the land that we were building on back then. There have been a lot of environmental changes now that make it harder to develop some homes than was the case back then. And I think the two things that could make this different, if they were to happen, is do we zone in a way that increases density, that allows us to build more again, or I had a number two, but I don't remember what it was.
Or do
Oh, I
we-
know what it was.
Yeah.
Do we extend public utilities in a way that makes the environmental restrictions no longer relevant?
I was going to say, or do we allow for additional permits to be processed in that year? So there's a couple large properties where we only go through 50 permits per year. We do have the ability to increase that, not saying we want to. What's that?
25.
25, I apologize. I mean, that is within our purview. I'm not saying that's what we want to do because of the impacts, but that's another way of increasing.
Even that, though, I would suggest be a timing thing. You might get more units faster.
Yep.
But that wouldn't lead to that happening over and over.
Correct.
Again.
Yeah.
And on not suggesting, I want to point out, I'm not sitting here advocating for greater density
Right.
or to expand water and sewer. Just saying, without those things happening, it's hard to imagine us ever returning to something like we once experienced.
Right.
You'll see in 21 and 22, we had 600 and 500 units. But they kind of stick out when you look at this, getting close to 20-year history. Oh, yeah, and last year, we actually were just a little bit over 200 units. This is permits for commercial industrial building. This is not as useful a graph because any one permit can vary so much. It could be for a $300,000 building or a $30 million building, but it gives you some idea of the level of activity.
The age-restricted communities that are starting to grow in or develop in Carroll County, where are they? Are they considered residential permits or are they considered commercial industrial permits?
Residential.
They're considered residential. Even though they're in commercial zone properties, they're still residential permits?
The residential units, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Huh. So the apartments, because like I'm thinking of like, you have the condos on 26. Is each, it's, I don't know how many units are in that
Yeah.
building. Each one is a permit or is it a permit for that entity?
I'm not sure.
I'm just curious how that works because, again, when we sit up and say, well, there's less growth happening, but people are seeing more growth happening because of these type of
Yeah.
units. The one down in by Nell's Acres by the bridge on 26 is very large, and I'm just curious.
So I think it probably depends on what your definition of a permit is. And I think that goes
Okay.
way beyond this conversation.
Yeah.
They pull permits for lots of different things, electrical, plumbing, but these are building permits for the actual building. So my
Yeah.
guess is, my guess is that might count as one building.
I don't
but
know.
I'm not
I
really
just-
sure. We could find out.
Yeah, could we do that? For
I don't
slide
know.
40, you mean? I'd be curious to know that, because,
Yeah.
yeah, if you're building, you should, it's a good question.
I mean, I think it's a point of clarification if we're saying residential permits, but there are 12 families living in that, building, then just apples to apples type of thing, so we understand.
We'll find out, because I did.
Thanks.
But I think
That's all.
there's a perception by some that there's a lot of growth, but all of this shows us that growth has slowed.
either slowed or stay stagnant. I agree, and that's why the
Yeah.
clearer we can become in creating a
Yes.
kind of like that perception of, hey, this is what reality is, the better we are. So we're,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, we'll ask, I mean, townhouses would be the same kind of thing, anything multifamily.
yeah,
would be-
townhouses, but I mean, there's like 3, 4
Yep, different.
over 55 communities that are being built in the South, and,
And,
yeah.
and you'd have to think it's individual units because they're gonna want a UNO and people moving in individual units before the entire building's done.
Again, I don't know.
You'd
There have to
think
be
so.
individual UNOs, and that's true. But you're right, but I'm not sure. So
Yeah.
we'll find out. I don't want to misstate.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so when I said building permits is not a large revenue, you are talking about $500,000. In context of our budget, this does not move the needle.
Right.
And we backed off a little bit, but again, it's really not significant. Okay, now on to the operating plan. There are lots of assumptions built into the operating plan. There are a few things we know about the future, but there's a lot more we don't know than we do know. And what we have to do is make assumptions. A lot of our work is trying to make the best assumption that we can. Now, sometimes we're given assumptions, and Carroll County Public Schools is one of those things. They're planned to grow 3.13 in fiscal year '25. That's an arrangement the last board put in place, a multi-year 3.13, and then that's followed by 3% growth. Salaries, there's 5.55 in '25, followed by 5%. Sheriff is built in at 4%. There's a question, why is the sheriff at 4 and everybody else is at 5? Because there were 3 years where the commissioners made very, very significant changes to the sheriff's salary. So this is slightly smaller growth on top of a much larger base. Where we don't have a specific assumption to make, we build in 3% a year. Something people often misunderstand here, I want to make sure I don't leave out there. Building in a 3% growth does not mean when the time comes that growth happens. Every year, every budget gets re-examined, and some will come in higher than we planned, many come in lower than we planned. And for agencies that report to the board, and you'll see this when we get to recommended budget, there will be many more who come in with something less than we planned on than come in with more than we planned on, or even what we planned on. Corrections, we have 5% growth, and that's because they have certain costs that just are growing differently than costs in general. And that's medical, prescriptions, food, and to some extent, this is driven by inmate population, but we've been fairly stable in recent years. So there were other times where I might have built in an increase because population had risen, but that's not what's going on here. Intergovernmental, this is the revenue sharing plan with the towns. This growth is driven by population and inflation. Population growth hasn't been great. We have gone through some inflation growth. That's moderated some. And it could be that this will be a little bit of an under-assumption in the short term, but we'll have to see how that goes. Debt service is tied to either bonds we've already issued or bonds that are planned to be issued. If the board wants debt service to be something less in the future than we've planned, the way to get there is not to talk about debt service, it's to talk about what capital projects you're going to do and what bonds you're going to put on those capital projects. Mm-hmm. We sometimes in the past have gotten into difficult conversations, where I had to say, well, you said you wanted this capital project and you said to issue debt to make it happen. You can't object to the debt service now. Well, you can, but it doesn't work. Then we had the assumed use of surplus of 1%, mentioned a little bit earlier. I'd love to see that go away someday. We build in our reserve for contingencies at 1% of the annual revenues, your ongoing revenues. Remember, this is your first line of flexibility in the operating budget when something unexpected comes up. And also remember that in many years, this remains largely unspent, which is a little bit earlier, what I told you. And is really, over the years, as we've squeezed the budget more and more to get rid of kind of contingency money or what-if money, there's only a few places where we expect any significant amount of money to be unspent at the end of the year. That's reserve for contingencies, the roads budget, the corrections budget, public works in general. Forget anybody?
Public Works is the big one.
But other than that, it's little bits and pieces. Nonprofit service providers, this isn't a big thing, not big money, but we have specific assumptions that are different for each of the nonprofit service providers. And this actually goes back to the board in fiscal year 17. There wasn't any particular methodology to this. It was just a agency by agency decision, 1%, 2%, 4%. With the exception of Access Carroll, which this board changed in the last budget from an assumed flat to an assumed 3% growth, those growth rates are all still the same ones that were chosen back in fiscal year 17. AgPres, we have to build in debt service for the IPAs we've already taken on. We build in some assumption of IPAs in the future, although we've largely moved away from IPAs in recent years. It's been much more about lump sum purchases, which is okay for us because keeping track of the IPAs is much more complicated than keeping track of the lump sum purchases. And the last board capped how much we make available for lump sum purchases at $2.5 million. And we'll talk more about this when we get into the recommended budget, but just a reminder here, there are multiple sources of revenue for AgPres. There's the money that we get from the state. There's the money we put in to match the state. There's ag transfer tax. There's the money that we put aside for IPAs, and then there's the money that is for cash purchases. Board of Elections, we built in at 5%. This is just recognition that the state is telling us what we need to spend here, and it's growing faster than most things. And in fact, if anything, we're probably a little concerned that this number really needs to be higher than it is. Pension and OPEB, starting point for those at least, is based on the actuarial assumptions that we receive. And this is something that was going to get some conversation as we go through the process, I think. Unlike debt service, where you have a long-term obligation and you know what you have to pay. Once you take on the debt service, you can't say 1 year, you know what, things are tough, let's back a little off debt service. On pensions and OPEB, we can. Now, I don't want to throw that out as a let's do this, because there's all kind of reasons not to fund less than we think we need to. Just saying that you do have the option to do that. On the other side of this, though, I have concerns about pensions because the growth in employees for EMS has not been fully captured in the most recent studies, and the growth in sheriff salaries hasn't been fully captured in the most recent actuarial. So even though we have room to back off of our funding, we have some very compelling reasons not to back off of our funding. Risk, we have growing at 5% a year. Again, this is just recognition of how actual costs are changing for us. And, in risk, we're talking about workers' compensation, we're talking about vehicles, buildings, all the things that we either self-insure for or are paying an insurer to cover us. And then there are lots of other smaller specific assumptions, dozens, maybe hundreds, I don't know. And just to give an idea of how we go about this, we really are trying to make this be as accurate a reflection as we can. You know, in permits, there's a set of books we have to buy once every 3 years, costs $7,000. We actually put that in 1 year, we skip 2 years, and then we put it in again the next third year. It's something we know, we can build it in, so we try to do that. Some things that are changing the plan.
I apologize. Another, I mean, I guess we can go on and on about different op plan assumptions, but the veteran support, the 9 Carroll, these are all, you know, ongoing assumptions within our op plan. You know, that we have, again, the authority to move one way or another. And I would expect there's others that you're just not throwing, these are like big muscle movement type of assumptions, but there's others that are significant, you know, I mean.
Yeah, well, there aren't a whole lot of things that are fully discretionary that are big.
Right.
But there are some. And just so people understand, you know, you mentioned Not and Carroll and the Veterans Transit.
Yep.
Both are 100% discretionary. The commissioners could say, cut it in half, stop it, totally up to them. We would never bring you a recommendation, though, that assumes those going away, because for me, that's a policy change.
Right.
That's yours to make. Now, I might remind you.
Yeah, and that's,
Veterans Transit if you want.
and that's what this is. I mean, an assumption that these are staying, you know, like these
Yes.
other op plan assumptions, just like those two I threw out, are op plan assumptions that they are in place.
Yes.
And they will remain in place.
Yep.
Okay, good, because I like that assumption.
In fleet, it's not as bad as it was a couple years ago, but we continue to see cost changes for vehicles and for parts and
Right.
everything that goes along there. In IT, similar thing, but it's also something different going on. It's not the first time I've brought this up,
Yeah.
but we are going through a major shift from what used to be buying hardware and some software to buying very little hardware and buying a lot more software. And the software always, I don't know if that's true, but if not, pretty close to true, comes with service and maintenance agreements. And this is a significantly growing cost. It's becoming a bigger part of our budget. It's a concern for me, but there's really nothing we can do about it, other than just say, we're not going to use that software. But if it's something we need, it's the world that we're dealing with now. Then specifically, we have the migration of the land management system, Acela. Support is ending for the arrangement we have. We are being forced into one of these things now where we are moving to a software solution outside of this building. This was not a planned cost. So it's not in the current plan, but it has to be in your new plan. Medical, you know, we build in the short term, funding based on recent experience, and then we build in assumed increases in the future. The further out we go, the larger the increase we build, because we recognize that we don't know what will be happening. We don't want to create a situation where you're forced to catch up on these costs. But we have a long history of pretty good experience here, and usually as we get closer, we're able to back off of our assumptions. And I said we're still working on things. This is one we're specifically still working on, and could change and improve the bottom line before we come back to you in 2 weeks. Don't want to suggest it's going to fix the problems, though, but, you know, it can make it a little bit better. Rec and Parks, there's actually a two-sided thing. Maybe I skipped over it. Public Works actually has a decline, and Rec and Parks has an increase, because we are moving some people and some functions from Public Works to Rec and Parks. Pensions, I talked about a little bit earlier. Transfer to capital. Remember, this is money that we're moving from the general fund to the capital fund to put cash on projects. I mentioned a few things earlier that will be in the recommended budget where that will happen. In past years, the commissioners have made decisions to do some of this.
Moving folks over to the Farm Museum from DPW, right? Aren't we doing that?
Rec and
or no?
Parks.
Rec and
Rec and
Parks.
Parks?
From DPW to Rec and Parks.
DPW Rec and Parks. Nothing's, I thought, is there equipment that we, no? Over to Farm Museum? Okay. Yeah, I'm just thinking Rec and Parks. Okay, I
Oh, no,
apologize.
I think Commissioner Ralston, you may be thinking about the building that we went ahead and agreed to construct over there, and then there was gonna be an operation over there for Farm Museum workers, and the idea was that it would create, in addition to letting them do their work on site, there would also be the ability for DPW to use that building in the event of an emergency or vice versa.
I thought it was moving people from DPW to do the work there. No?
I don't,
Okay,
well, you're on the right track, though.
okay, cool.
Here are some changes that made the plan better off. Debt service. This is mostly a timing thing. Yeah, the only thing that really makes debt service go away would be if there's a project that you said, we're not gonna fund it, or there's a significant decrease in interest rates from what we've planned. Public Works, this is the flip side of Rec and Parks I mentioned earlier. Transfer to transit. We were able to use in '25 some of the remaining federal funding, so we didn't have to put in general funds that we normally would, but this is a short-term change. The rest of the plan still assumes that we're gonna need to do this. And similarly, with workers' compensation, we have what's called an internal service fund. So we're self-insured for workers' compensation. There is a separate pot of money called this internal service fund. And every year, we put money from the general fund into the internal service fund. And then when we make workers' comp payments, they're coming out of the internal service fund. This year, we believe that internal service fund is in a position that we don't need to add any money to it. So that makes your bottom line in '25 better off. This is another one, though, is not a long-term change. So it helps you in '25, but it doesn't help you in '26 and beyond. Okay, I'm not going to run through it all again, but this just captures in a spreadsheet some of the things we've been talking about. So things I think we need to talk about. And this is always a much longer list than I actually bring here, so I pick and choose, a few things. Solid waste. Okay, you know we have an enterprise fund, and you know that as with the current business model, that it can't support itself. And not only can it support itself, but there will be a growing general fund transfer. And if you look at the current plan against what we're bringing you, that's getting a little bit worse, $500,000 to $1 million worse. And there's a lot of things going on into the mix here. How much recycling, what's recycling costing, what's it costing to transfer, how much transfer are we doing, et cetera, et cetera.
I was going to ask you about that, Ted. Could you get us some numbers on recycling when you're able? Thank you.
One thing we need to be thinking about here is we bought 300 and some acres around the landfill, which opened up an option for us that we didn't have before, and that is to increase landfill space, which will allow us to decrease transferring, which is very expensive. We're still in the early stages of determining what should we do with this land. But whatever we do is going to be expensive. Right now, we have about $12 million set aside toward development of whatever we're going to do. I have no doubt $12 million is not what we are going to need. In saying that, I don't know what we're going to need. But if we find ourselves in a position where we have some money that's available and we're willing to put it aside for something we know is going to come, this would be a place where I'd say anything we can put aside today is going to make it easier to do this when the time comes. Should mention in school capital, we have design and construction for 4 pre-K kindergarten additions. The kindergarten portion of this goes back all the way to the mandate of full-day kindergarten. There's four elementary schools we never got to. They are going to happen now in conjunction with meeting the pre-K need. And then there's additional money beyond the short term for future pre-K. This is a very, very uncomfortable situation right now. You know, the current blueprint legislation says the private sector is going to provide 50% of this. We know that that's not going to be true. Right now, we have no mandate to provide capacity for 100%. But if we're going to get 100%, do we just pretend that it's not going to happen? And there's no easy answer here. Either we spend money beyond what the law requires us to, or we kind of close our eyes a bit and pretend that something that's going to happen isn't going to happen. And I don't know what the answer to that is. We have funding for systemics, roofs, HVACs, sometimes windows, fire alarm systems, electrical systems. The reason we need to do this is because we are doing very few modernizations or replacements of schools. We're not attacking the whole thing, so we have to go after the pieces.
Ted, remind me what systemics are?
Roofs, HVAC,
Okay, that, all
electrical
right.
systems, all the piece. You know, if you were going in to renew a building, all the stuff you would do at one time is the same things we're doing piece by piece.
Gotcha, okay. Thank you.
And just so I can speak on behalf of the school people, since we went down this road, you know, one thing that they would say is when you do piece by piece, one thing that doesn't happen is recognize that there are changes in how education is delivered. Redoing the roof doesn't help you address that. A modernization would. One really good news story here. We've been going through a bubble of replacing roofs. The last roof is actually in this plan. In fiscal year '29, we will get to the last one. That doesn't mean we're never going to replace roofs again, but things have changed now. You know, we've gotten through a bubble, and the reason we had a bubble was because we were doing a lot of construction, and because of limitations of how much money was available, we were making choices to put lesser quality roofs on that came due sooner. This will be a lot more spread out now, in large part because many of the roofs have higher quality roofs. We did a lot of metal roofs in these recent ones that instead of having a life of 20 years might have a life of 40 or 50 years. So this is really something that, you know, feels good to say, well, got that taken care of. Should point out, not in our recommendation, Sykesville Middle School and Freedom Elementary School. And I have no doubt that this is going to get a lot of conversation. And there's two things driving this. One is concern in the southeast area about over too many kids for the capacity it has. I want to point out, though, what's proposed for Freedom doesn't actually address that problem.
Right.
Then from your side of the street, we have another problem, which is overcapacity getting in the way of approving developments, which is not a problem we can just say, oh, well, because we can't say no forever because there's overcapacity. So the school system might have some reasons why they want these projects to happen. You might have some reasons why you want these projects to happen. Now, remember, we have dedicated local income tax, which is how we fund our school construction program. We do have capacity. We can take on more than is the plan now. But if we get into that conversation, we need to think carefully about exactly what that means, because the capacity can't be immediately renewed. You know, it's dependent on how much income tax is coming in, which is another side note. Reducing our expectations for income tax also reduces our expectations for how much money is available here. And when we use that dedicated revenue, we can use it two ways. We can put cash on a project, we can actually buy a brick, or we can issue debt service, which means we're going to pay the debt service on having bought that brick. When we pay debt service, we're committing to 20 years worth of payments. So the more committed you are to debt service, the less flexibility you have in how you use this money, because You've taken it off the table for years. If we put cash in, you spend it, and it's available again the next year. The hard part is, the more you want to do with cash, the less you can actually accomplish. The more you want to do with debt service, the more you can accomplish. So what this becomes is a trade-off between how fast do you want to get done, and how long do you want to commit this money. And this is one of those, there's no right or wrong to this, it's just what choice do you want to make, and making sure that we recognize the implications of doing it. And for advocates for getting schools done, it's an easy thing for somebody to say, well, just sell bonds. They get the project that they want, but don't necessarily have to worry that, well, we can't do another project like this for 15 years.
The impact of building Sykesville Middle, we had the conversation, I don't know if it was last week, a couple weeks ago, about the municipalities. They, growth in municipalities can and do create impact on the facilities and the schools. But we are not holding them accountable to put in the dollars or the resources. And Sykesville Middle is one of them. I mean, they would feed into Piney Elementary, and that's, fine at this point. But they do feed into Sykesville Middle. And if we're looking at creating more space in Sykesville Middle, which is needed, then we should be talking to the municipalities that feed into Sykesville Middle. And I don't know if that's across the county, if there's other, schools, or, I'm picking on schools, but it could be roads, it could be anything, fire, EMS, police, we've not had those conversations. I think we need to have those very direct conversations with the municipalities on their responsibility and holding them accountable for the services we provide. That may chip away at some of this, but,
I think I hear the emails coming into your phone already.
that's good, because we've got to have that open conversation, so.
Do we know where we stand with East Middle and Career and Tech? Have we used all that money that was in the budget? Neither,
Well, we're still spending on both of them.
yes.
We did approve a transfer to East Middle School. I have not heard any other concerns on either of those projects that we're worried about being overspent.
And then, obviously, you have yet to put Sykesville Middle and Freedom Elementary into the recommended budget. I just have to wonder, there's been a lot of talk about them happening. Would we be better off to have it in the recommended budget? We can always add them, we can always take them out, but is a better picture that they be in the recommended budget?
Better for who?
Us,
Oh.
making our decisions.
Okay, well, if the board says we want to see them in, we can still do that before we come back. My biggest concern on that would be, we probably would have to schedule time with you to talk about this before we can do it, because we would need to decide how do we want to fund them.
Right.
Because that has big implications for what happens after that.
And we've got an upcoming joint meeting with them. Should that be on the agenda, maybe, for us to at least find out where they are with it, what they think they're going to get funding for it? And I don't know if they've done any budgets yet or not.
Any what? If they've done,
Any budgets on Sykesville or Freedom Elementary, whether have they started anything happening on design on, they did studies,
Yeah.
but
I
have
see
they
what you're
done
saying.
anything more concrete?
I don't think so, have they?
They don't have a budget to do
Yeah.
design yet.
They haven't,
Yeah.
they haven't obligated, they don't have money obligated towards it, so therefore they haven't executed anything,
Yeah.
I believe,
Although, and that does bring us to another one of these awkward situations we have when we in the state are involved. The timeline for the school system to ask money from the state doesn't match up very neatly
Right.
with our timeline for building a budget. And we do sometimes end up in a situation where we have a state approval for money that the commissioners haven't agreed that they're willing to fund.
So they don't need us, our input to ask for state money?
No. Yeah, it's one of those places where you say, well, that doesn't make sense, but, you know,
Yeah,
it's what we've got.
yeah, if we're not gonna fund whatever half of it, why would the state wanna fund the other half?
Yeah, and it's a situation we want to avoid because, I mean, it is, state says we're in.
Yeah.
And then they have to go back and say, oh, the county's not willing to do this, take the money back.
Yeah.
You know, it's not the conversation you want to have.
No,
No, I mean, it would be forcing us into a corner to doing something.
yes.
And we don't want that, so,
And we've been there.
yeah, we've
We've
been there.
had situations where, okay, this wasn't our plan,
Right,
but they've got state money, do we really want to not do it?
right.
Real quick, your comments regarding freedom and things not changing, that's because that's where the trailers are?
Correct.
So if we, okay, and if we replace those, we.
Right, they're gonna create permanent capacity instead of temporary capacity.
Gotcha, thanks.
So again, there've been conversations about this, so it will change in the state's eyes, the capacity number, but it's not gonna free up a seat for anybody.
Right.
In theory.
Which again, I've never understood why the commissioners want to tie building to how the state does capacity of schools. Other than, I mean, my humble opinion, most of this came about to slow down growth. Growth is pretty slow right now. I don't
Well,
know that that's a motive anymore.
I think the reason would be if the solution is building, that we'd want the state to be in. And if the state says there's not capacity, they won't be in.
Yeah.
Right. A quick question, the pre-kindergarten, besides the classrooms, are there requirements for the playgrounds for pre-kindergarten? In addition to the playgrounds that are currently at the schools, because the playgrounds that are currently at the schools are for, I would imagine, K through 5. And I thought early on, I heard that there was an additional requirement for pre-K playgrounds, and I don't know what that cost is or anything about, but I don't even know if that's a factor or,
That's the first time I've heard that.
Yeah,
Which
but-
doesn't mean it's not.
Right.
But if it is, it's not come to my attention.
Yeah.
But we can check.
I mean, maybe it's just nap time or something, I don't know, but,
They are only half day, so it's not like they have a whole lot of time to be.
right.
going out.
I don't know, but if it is a additional cost, I'd like to know it before.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think it is, but,
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, that stuff changes all the time.
Okay.
Okay, some other things. The opioid restitution funding has started to come in. A lot of restrictions on it. We had some concerns about how are we going to use this money. Right now, there is an expenditure which is mandated, this medically assisted treatment, this is in the detention center, that looks like it can match up with the opioid funding, which would be, for us, the best of all possible worlds. It'll give us a way to use the opioid funding and keep us from having to come up with money for the expenditure. Cannabis funding has also started coming in. There are two streams of money. One is restricted, one is not. The restricted one is larger, which is not to say large, but it is larger. There are concerns about what are we going to do with this money, but those are conversations that are actually happening right now.
And that's not much, right? I mean, we're talking about, what, 80,000 or something?
Yes, that was
Yeah,
our
it's-
first payment was. So this is one of those things where it's not going to be enough money to do big aggressive programs, but you have to do with it what the restrictions require of you. So I expect it's going to be complicated. Maybe we'll end up with something like the MAT that, falls into place, but right now I don't think we've seen that. EMS billing, as we begin running more and more of these calls. EMS billing is becoming a bigger part of the picture. Just a couple things to think about. I've been asked, how much is this going to be? My answer is, I don't know. We don't have enough data to say what we can expect. Going back to when the volunteers were collecting more of this money, there were differences in how they approached things, how they dealt with billing, and we don't have good data on what they were getting. So I really think we're probably a couple of years away from having a really good idea of what billing is eventually going to be. Whatever it is will help, but I don't believe it will ever be enough to fundamentally change how we're looking at funding, what we're doing. The other piece of this is the Medicare portion, which is supplemental or in addition to the EMS billing. We're working through how to take advantage of that. That's an even smaller piece. I think maybe expectations were a little too high in some initial conversations. But in both cases, it will offset some level of funding we would need to find. PFAs and Piney Run Dam, you mentioned these a little bit earlier. These are two projects. We're near the end of the process. You removed funding. We are suggesting putting that funding back. We think it's going to have to be done sometime. I want to argue for doing it while we have the resources rather than waiting to see what happens later.
Well, I know we're, signed on to that lawsuit, and I know one of those multi-billion-dollar companies or whatever has agreed to settle. Do we have any idea what we're getting from that part of the settlement yet? Not yet? Okay.
I thought
It's another thing where I don't, well, if we do know, I don't know.
No, I was just gonna say, I thought we put, like $3 million to the side for PFAS.
It is something like that, but
Yeah.
there was more in there and you
Oh,
removed some of it.
Got it, okay.
Ultimately, that'll be the cost of whatever has to happen. If it's water, it'll be in that enterprise fund. If it's at the landfill, it'll be in that enterprise fund, or will it be kept separate in the general fund?
I guess we'll have to talk about that. Now, for the landfill, being in the enterprise fund is an accounting thing because they
Oh, I
don't have
know.
the money to do it. In utilities, it would become a user rate thing. And I think what we'd have to talk about there is, are the PFAs inherently tied to that system, or is it some bigger problem that they're
Yes.
left to deal with? If it's the first, I would say, yeah, it goes in the rates. If it's the second, then I'd say we have to look at general tax dollars somehow being part of that
I
picture.
mean, to me, the biggest challenge right now with PFAS is that the EPA has still not defined PFAS, and as far as the threshold. So therefore, the capture, contain, destruction, and disposal is still very, I won't say subjective, but throughout the state, I think you're going to see different folks doing different things and across the country, actually. Yeah, I won't say until EPA, but everybody's starting to define it their own ways. Maryland has, it's like 150 pages of what to do with PFAS, So I'd be interested to know how the county is addressing this, and I don't want to say doing the bare minimum, but not going above and beyond where we just don't know right now.
Yeah.
So,
Well, right now, we're not addressing it. All we're doing is trying to understand the problem.
right.
And you mentioned northern landfill. This is actually a change from last year. The conversation last year was about the Public Safety Training Center. Now we have been specifically directed to look at the landfill. Don't know where that will go, but when we get to the point of remediation, when we have been told, here's what you have to do, my thinking on this is just, I'm much, much more worried that it's going to cost more than anything we're planning for than I am hopeful that it's going to cost less than we're
Right.
planning for.
Yeah.
For utility rates, there should be a presentation coming to you sometime in the near future on setting rates. This will be a much bigger conversation, but I want to remind you, we have a pretty good idea what it costs to run the system. If you know what the costs are, it's just math to say, what do the rates have to be to generate that much revenue? And there's always a desire to not increase the rates. But the only thing that can come of that is utilities will not be doing something that they need to be doing. There's really no other path.
And in addition, when the rates are addressed and raised, they are more steeper. They're higher than if we did it a year or two at a time, as opposed to on the fifth year or something, and it becomes pretty ugly.
Yes. Transit funding, this, I believe, is worthy of a very significant conversation. Not a new idea, you've heard this from me before, but I'm going to be bringing two things together. One is this is a place where you have, I believe, total discretion. We don't have to do this. And we've been doing what we've been doing, things have changed over time, without ever a clear vision of what is it we want transit to accomplish in Carroll County. And we have a mix of serving seniors and disabled, providing an on-demand service for anybody who wants to use it, providing fixed routes in certain places. If you're looking for money, I think this is a place where you could say, are we really willing to continue spending what we're spending to accomplish these things? I'm not trying to decide that for you, but I'm just saying there's a question there.
What's the price tag on that?
I don't have an easy answer. There's a lot of grant funding in the
Is there?
mix, but we
Okay.
can have
Okay.
that for
Yeah,
you when we.
I think that would be, you don't have to do that, but that would be a good thing to understand.
But on that point, there are changes coming in federal and state funding.
Yeah,
It's really not a question, are they coming? The question is, what is it going to look like?
Right.
But it almost certainly is going to be pushing more of the responsibility onto county funding. So to keep doing exactly what we're doing is going to require more funding from us than what we're doing today. Now, I know there are constituencies for all those things that I was talking about. So there are people who I'm sure will be anxious to argue why we should continue, which of course is always one of our challenges. No constituency ever wants to give up what they've got. But if there's not enough money and you have to think about things, I don't know how you avoid having that conversation. Solid waste, we already hit on. Vacancies, some of what we've done in the last few years with salary increases and a long list of other changes we've made to make Carroll County a more attractive employer, we have had some success. We've filled some positions that were long-term problems. But I don't want to leave an idea that all the problems have gone away. We're still struggling in places, sometimes in specific positions. Two of our really big struggles are roads and corrections. We have constant, significant number of open positions in both of those places. I'm not saying I know what the solution is to that, but I just want to make sure we don't feel like mission accomplished. And fire EMS transition, we are getting close now to knowing what this is going to cost. Other than things that you might still say, we want to fund something that isn't part of the current plan. So where does this leave us? So all this is leading to the new operating plan. Here's where we were, which is an ugly enough picture. And here's where we are with everything we just talked about. And fiscal year 30 isn't on here because there's no comparison for it, but that's approximately $35 million in the hole. I do want to point out, when I said at the end of end of the fiscal year 24 process, the commissioners took some money off of cash off of capital projects. So we said we're not going to transfer those from the general fund to the capital fund, but we left the funding in FY '24. So what that really was one-time funding. We knew it wasn't going to continue. The $13 million in the hole for FY '25 is largely about that one-time funding that we put in there. A piece of it is about the revenue change, but the biggest part is about, the choice to leave the one-time funding. And then that carries through. So we would have negatives on every single one of these years, but they would be smaller. Well, maybe 26 might be balanced. But the others would still be negative, but smaller.
So, Ted, this does not include the Board of Education's recent budget.
No.
And their recent budget is requesting $10.8 million in addition to what this is
Yes.
in our budget. Okay. So that's significant,
Oh my
just
gosh, yes.
to recognize that just by itself.
And we'll have, maybe not that much more, but we'll have other things from many of the other departments.
Yes. And for everybody who's planning to come in to talk to the commissioners, and just to now you know, the message to agencies has been, the only reason to come in is if you're asking for something that was not included in the recommended budget. But there are people who will be coming in, and I hope that people at least acknowledge that they're asking for it, and this is our starting point.
Yeah, asking for it above and beyond this. Now, the best course of action is when somebody comes in and says, oh, no, we don't want this much, take
Yeah.
it back, but
I'll bet.
don't expect that to.
Wouldn't expect that, no.
And I apologize, I need to leave for another meeting, so you'll have to close. And then one of the things, and I just saw this on social media yesterday, all the asks for more money, some of those we didn't allow, some of those we cut in half, and the mindset of some of the less smart public, oh, you cut so-and-so. Well, we didn't cut them, we just didn't add everything they asked for. We did not cut their budget, and I don't know that we can change that confusion, but it's ironic how people look at it.
Yep. And when I have the opportunity, I always try to remind people that that's not the way it works. That's why I say, with the when we talk about the capital budget and people ask me, well, how much did you cut from the requests? And I tell them, they didn't cut. I don't start with the requests. That.
Right.
So I can't tell you how much.
And the
And
CCPS.
feel free to talk another hour, but I gotta.
And
We're actually almost done.
CCPS budget that is in place within our budget today is above and beyond their maintenance of effort. Correct?
Yes. And in fact, your planned funding is in excess of their maintenance of effort.
By about $2 million or something.
I was thinking 3, but
Okay, I'll take 3.
we're,
But just because, this is, it's important. Our partnership and relationship with Board of Education and CCPS is very, very strong. But you got to put all the cards on the table and say, here's the budget, here's what they're requesting, here's the maintenance of effort, here's above and beyond the maintenance of effort that we have embedded in our budget today, proposed budget today. And by the way, they're asking, or not asking, they're requesting $10.8 million in addition to that. Okay.
yeah, and that's, a good point about maintenance of effort. Another place a lot of people misunderstand. Carroll County almost always funds in excess of maintenance of effort, and often significantly in excess. I think this is my 30th budget, and I think there have been 3 years that we funded at maintenance of effort.
Wow.
So it's It's definitely not the norm. In fact, you'd have to say it's really the exception.
Yeah. Okay.
So this is our starting point. And yeah, there's really only two things we can do. You raise tax rates to have more revenue, or you reduce services to reduce your costs, or some combination of those two things. Neither is a desirable path. But we have the picture we have. It's possible that this will end up being better than what we see here if income taxes the last half of the year is stronger than we have assumed. But it's not going to be strong enough. I don't believe there's any chance it will be strong enough to correct this picture. So we will be back on the 19th to bring you our recommended budgets. And when we say recommended, that's operating plan, capital plan, all the pieces of your budget. That will be followed by the agency sessions where they can bring to you their issues. And again, issues being, commissioners, we'd like you to consider funding for X that was not included in the recommendation. Sine die 4-8, your proposed sessions are between 4-2 and 4-18. Do you remember how many hours we have set up?
I would have to look, but it was over 20.
20 some hours. But the reminder I give this time every year, almost every year we get to a point in the proposed process where somebody says, wait a second, we don't have enough time left. So I just encourage you to be very, very conscious of time and how we use it and how we get through that. We will set up things to try and give you structure you can work with. We will have scenarios on the computer. So we will try to anticipate things that you might want to explore and have it ready to go. We also do our best to deal with what ifs that we had not anticipated. For many years, Deb is the one who has been doing those what ifs. This will be Heidi's first time at doing this. So be gentle with her. We're scheduled to release our proposed budget, your proposed budget, on the 23rd of April. That will be followed, starting the next day, by me visiting 5 libraries to share what's in your budget and take comments and questions. Public hearing is set for 5-6. We have adopted sessions on 5-14 and 5-16. We usually don't need 2 sessions, but we schedule it that way in case conversation goes somewhere the first day that gets in the way of getting done. Adoption is set for the 21st. We have to adopt by the last day of May. And just a reminder, there's very, very little flexibility in this schedule. There's not room to bump things back. If we lose a proposed session, if we're limited to certain days of the week, there's probably no room to make it up again. The only way to add would be to either extend your time in a day or to add a day that's not part of your regular days. This all gets scheduled. We basically are starting with the end and backing up to when do things have to happen in order for us to get done. And also on flexibility, it's pointed out another piece of this. Some decisions that you might make create work for the budget office to capture in the budget. Some things are fairly easy to do, some get pretty complicated. Some things that you might not think are hard to do are harder than you think. The earlier we have the decisions, the easier it is to get things done. What's really hard is if on adoption, one of the adopted work sessions, an idea comes up to make a change that's going to touch 30 budgets, and it can be difficult to do it. We'll do what we need to do, but I just want you to be aware. So weren't looking for any decisions today, trying to give you things to be thinking about. And again, if if today's conversation led any of you or the board to any thinking on something you need, want to change, we can take all that with us.
Any thoughts, gentlemen?
Just thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Well, if there's nothing else, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn?
Do I have a second?
Second?
All those in favor?
Aye.
We are adjourned.